The EU and the UN have called for independent investigation into mass graves discovered at Al-Shifa and Nasser hospitals in Gaza. And now the US has chimed in too. This was US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan.
Those reports were deeply disturbing. We have been in touch at multiple levels with the Israeli government. We want answers. We want to understand exactly what happened. You've seen some public commentary from the IDF on that, but we want to know the specifics of what the circumstances of this were, and we want to see this thoroughly and transparently investigated so that the whole world can have a comprehensive answer, and we, the United States, can as well.
You'll have noticed that that wasn't a call for an independent investigation, and while the world awaits that specific, transparent, and definitely thorough report from the potential perpetrators of the crimes in question, Joe Biden last night signed into law a $17 billion aid package to Israel. Meanwhile, the details emerging from Gaza grow ever grimmer. Al Jazeera has reported on new evidence of torture on some of the nearly 400 bodies exhumed from two mass graves. According to a member of Gaza's Civil Defense Force, 10 bodies have been found with bound hands. Others still had medical tubes attached to them, suggesting they may have been buried alive. And Al Jazeera also says it has seen video and photographic evidence of the bodies of children in the mass graves. It's in that context that Jerusalem Deputy Mayor Flair Hassan appeared on Sky News. Kate Burley began the interview by asking her this.
At least 283 corpses found in a mass grave at Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. The UN Human Rights Chief has said he is absolutely horrified. Who do you think those bodies are?
Probably terrorists, because the ratio of combatant to innocent that Israel has is unprecedented in modern warfare. We know we've killed about 15,000 terrorists. There was a terrible battle in those areas. So the chances
are... How do you think these people died?
In gun battles with Israel.
Why do you think some of the bodies were found with ties around their hands?
Well, because we probably arrested the terrorists.
And then killed them?
Well, I don't know if the terrorists fought back. I wasn't there.
Striking, isn't it? Presented with the suggestion that IDF troops may have executed handcuffed people. The deputy mayor doesn't say, of course not. She says, I don't know, and maybe they fought back. Now that suggests that, in her mind anyway, it's perhaps not totally unreasonable, let alone criminal proposition, that Israeli soldiers should kill people when their hands are tied. That interview went on.
Just to clarify for me, if you would, how do they fight back with their hands tied behind their backs?
Well, we don't know what they were doing before their hands were tied behind their backs, do we?
No, but if you've managed to cable tie them, they shouldn't,
yes, and maybe,
shouldn't subsequently find them dead, should we?
And maybe, again, we're just conjecturing. Maybe his friend threw a grenade, and then what happens? Maybe there was a missile, maybe they threw a rocket, and then what happens? Again, this is conjecture. I wasn't there, you weren't there. We can't know. All I know is that our army has the highest...
Neither was Amnesty International, and they say there's been a lack of access for human rights investigators.
It's a shame that they're not worried about the lack of access to hostages who haven't been visited.
Come on to hostages in a moment. That's also on my list to talk to you, but what would you say to Amnesty International saying there's been a lack of access for human rights investigators?
We're in the middle of a war. They want access. They'll have access after the war. How could we let them in? Let's say we let them in and 3 of them get killed. And then what happens? Who's to blame?
Now, she isn't wrong. It would be extremely dangerous for investigators to enter Gaza during a war, although somehow the UN has managed to produce a report on human rights abuses in the Russia-Ukraine war. But given the overwhelming evidence that has emerged of war crimes in Gaza, it's yet another compelling reason to order a ceasefire, which would allow investigators into Gaza. Of course, that may not be in Israel's interests. On the subject of IDF brutality, in another part of that interview, Burley brought up Israel's Netza Yehuda battalion. Stationed in the West Bank, it's facing sanctions from the US over its inhumane treatment of Palestinians. Here's what Hassan had to say about that.
I think it sets a very, very bad precedent, not just for Israel, but for any law-abiding country with its own internal army scrutiny.
Are you proud of this unit?
Well, of course not. Who can be? I'm proud of the unit. I'll tell you why. I'm proud of the unit because it's done something that the whole of Israeli society want the ultra-Orthodox to do, and that is serve their country. And some wonderful, wonderful examples of young men who are serving their country, who used to be learning full time, whose parents actually threw them out of their homes because they decided to serve their country. Am I proud of the behavior or one or two rogue members of that unit? Of course not. They should be in jail, and many of them already went to jail.
There have been several other incidents, as I'm sure you're aware, in recent years, some captured on video, in which soldiers were accused of or charged with abusing Palestinian detainees. So I suppose the suggestion is that it's not just a one-off by this battalion.
Like I said, any single army in the world, you could say about the American army, you could say it about the British army. If you went into every single piece of behavior that they do, you would find things that are not acceptable. And this is what's happened here. But like I said, the Israeli army, the IDF, has very robust internal investigation scrutiny. We have soldiers, our own soldiers in jail. We have our own soldiers who've been dismissed. We have our own apparatus. We don't need anybody to tell us how to handle our own army.
Now, immediately after that interview, something very interesting happened. Kay Burley went to Dominic Waghorn, Sky's correspondent in Jerusalem, and this is what he thought of that interview.
I think Fleur Hassan was incorrect in a number of ways, particularly to do with the Nessa Yehuda battalion, and so the record should be corrected. She said it's an old story. It's an old story in terms of what happened to Omar Assad, who was a 78-year-old Palestinian American man who Israeli soldiers from that battalion detained, handcuffed, blindfolded, gagged, and then left. And was then found to have died of a stress-induced heart attack, according to Palestinian doctors, sometime later. But it's old in the sense that that story is 2 years old. But what's not old is the fact that the American government is expected in the coming hours or days to cut off that particular battalion from American assistance under the Leahy laws, which prohibit the American government to giving any assistance, military or otherwise, to any members of foreign security forces who are guilty of gross or suspected to be guilty of gross violations of human rights and whose governments have not done enough to punish them. And that is a major development. It's the first time, if it happens, that the American government has sanctioned in this way any part of the Israeli military. And it could be the beginning of a process of other units being charged or at least alleged to have done this and then being punished in that sense by the Americans. She also said that the soldiers in that case were sent to jail, which is not correct. The Israeli authorities decided not to bring any criminal charges against any of the soldiers in that case, even though the IDF investigation found the units guilty of moral failings and a lack of discipline. One commanding officer was reprimanded and two soldiers were suspended for 2 years, but no one was sent to jail. And that, I have to say, is the norm, even though people like Israeli officials like Fleur Hassan insist that the Israeli military is one of the most moral in the world and say it has a robust prosecution system of holding soldiers to account. Very rarely are soldiers prosecuted in a criminal sense, and that certainly was the case with this incident involving the Nessa Yehuda battalion. She also says that that was a kind of, on the whole, the battalion is behaving in a way you'd expect it to. There are some rogue elements. The fact is, this battalion is notorious for a string of alleged human rights abuses, from unlawful killings, from the death of Omar Assad 2 years ago, but also including electrocution of Palestinians, sexual assault, torture, and other abuses. And therefore, that's one of the reasons it's been taken out of action from the West Bank and sent to the Golan. So I think she's misrepresented that battalion. And that is rather symptomatic, I think, of the way Israeli officials tend to downplay allegations against the Israeli military. And for the first time, the American government is not accepting that at face value and is now taking action against one battalion in the Israeli military.
Now, it isn't much, but I don't think we would have seen Sky's own correspondent debunking an Israeli official in real time on air 6 months ago, or even 2 months ago. The dial for what can be pushed back on seems to be moving for some of the mainstream media. But is it too little, too late? Taig, has mainstream media now decided that it's time to push back against official Israeli narratives of what's happening in Gaza? And if so, why now?
I feel like it obviously is too late for the people who have been murdered, of course. But no, it's not too late, because I think it's evidence of the fact that the protests are working, the rallies are working. I mean, politicians and mass media, they have to follow what the people want ultimately. If the protests are so significant and the rallies are so significant, they have to adapt. And I think 6 months into this genocide, people can see what way the wind is blowing, and it is definitely to be applauded that media is finally, and it's a paltry level, it's such a low level to call out the basic lies. But I think for too long, the Israeli regime has been used to lying and used to getting away with lying. I mean, even Fleur's basically following the blueprint that Israel always follows when it's accused of war crimes. It's like, initially, did you do it? No, it was Hamas. Okay, we did do it, but we didn't mean it. We did do it, we actually meant it, but there were terrorists. No, we did do it, we did mean it, and it was civilians, but why do you keep asking us questions? That's anti-Semitic. So I think everyone is seeing through the lies. The protests are growing in momentum, and I think people like Sky News and also leading politicians in Britain and the US are kind of seeing which way the wind blows, and they don't want to be complicit in a genocide, and they don't want to go down in history as a genocide apologist. So too little too late for the people who've been murdered, but I think for the wider Palestinian movement towards justice, liberation and statehood, I think it's a very significant development that Sky News are broadcasting such events, and that CNN in particular are capturing the thoughts of Jewish students on these campuses who, again, don't want to be associated with the Zionist project at all. And it's really important for those Jewish voices to stand up and be heard, because that's the other problem with the conflation that the Israeli regime does. It silences all those many Jewish voices. And as you know, and I know, some of the most important pro-Palestine voices are Jewish.
Is this also specific to English media, do you think? Have they been slower to push back on Israeli narratives?
I don't think so. I mean, even in Ireland here with our national broadcaster RT, for too long, they've followed the kind of party line in terms of what the IDF are telling them to say. So again, you get this, differentiation between the people and media and politicians. I mean, Ireland has been very guilty of making a lot of the right noises in terms of the politicians, but actually in real terms, the actions have been very small. And again, our media is very similar. So I think it's a case of the people, again, are hitting the streets and rallying and boycotting, and the numbers are growing to a point where the mass media and the politicians have to adapt. And that's why this latest development with the students, it's just going to keep rolling. And as you pointed out earlier, this was a key moment in Vietnam where the students started protesting, and the ordinary person, when they look at the peaceful protests of people and they look at the elitists who are running for cover and trying to smear them by saying that they're terrorists or they're mobs of anti-Semites, again, the average person kind of sees through this trick. And what's really going on is that, corporate interests are really under threat by, I hope and pray, the death of the Zionist hegemony.